I'm staring at the gaping hole in the ground where my family's ancestral cabin used to stand, dust still swirling in the morning light. My heart pounds like a jackhammer, every beat fueled by raw disbelief. How on earth did this escalate so fast? Moments ago, I was inside, rifling through old boxes of letters and documents, searching for a clue that might help me save our land. I never imagined I'd have to burst out the front door, screaming at a demolition crew to stop bulldozing a place that had stood here for well over a century. But it's too late now. My grandmother's rocking chair, our old wooden floors, even the antique fireplace that once kept us warm through dozens of biting New England winters, gone. Everything has been leveled to rubble by the Homeowners Association, or HOA, that thinks it has absolute jurisdiction in this small slice of rural America. Do you think you've seen injustice? Believe me, you haven't seen half of it. And I need you, yes, you watching right now, to stay with me and decide if this monstrous act of destruction was done under any valid authority at all. Because from my vantage point, the entire operation reeks of shady business, and I suspect we're about to unearth one of the biggest property frauds this sleepy town has ever witnessed. Before today, I'd mostly taken the HOA's existence for granted. Sure, they had rules about fence heights, about landscaping, about acceptable house colors, but I'd never seen them zero in on one family with such ferocity. Now I can see their white trucks parked in a neat row along my driveway, official insignias displayed brazenly on the sides, while a few men in fluorescent safety vests hunch over the remains of my cabin. They're rummaging through the debris, not with the genuine regret of having possibly made a mistake, but with the cold efficiency of professionals convinced they have every right to tear down a piece of my heritage. I'm choked with rage, sweat stings my eyes as I wrestle with two equally powerful instincts, to lash out in physical anger or to maintain control and gather evidence. I'm no saint, but I know better than to let them see me snap. If I explode now, any chance to prove this was a wrongful demolition might go out the window. Instead, I whip out my phone and start recording. I'm no legal genius, but I can sense this is going to be the battle of a lifetime. Of course, you might be asking, why is the HOA doing this in the first place? The official story is that the cabin was not properly registered under neighborhood guidelines, that it was an unapproved structure put up without essential permits. They claim to have served multiple notices which my family and I either ignored or refused to comply with. And get this, they also claim that the patch of land where the cabin stood was always part of the HOA's overarching property plan, meaning they have total authority to do what they please. They said the city zoning department backed them, that I'm the one who's refusing to follow the letter of the law. But that's where the cracks start to form. I have old records and testimonies from neighbors that my great-great-grandfather built that very cabin before any HOA even existed, and a close friend of mine who works in local government once hinted that the association has been using questionable methods to expand their domain. Now I fear that behind all those suits and official stamps, there might be a web of corruption so deep and so carefully disguised that no one dared question it. Until now, the scariest part, despite what they say, I never saw any demolition notice posted on my door. I never got warnings or phone calls or anything that would have tipped me off. That's a classic intimidation tactic. If you bury the victim in legal jargon and send the notices to the wrong address, you can sweep in and demolish the building before they can put up any defense. And here I am, picking through broken beams and shattered glass, numb with the realization that they might have succeeded. Except for one tiny detail that gives me hope. Just days earlier, I'd discovered a chest hidden under the floorboards. It was locked, tarnished with time, and sealed with a crest I recognized from an old family photograph. My mother used to speak of a secret deed that proved our land's independence from any future expansions or claims by outside groups. Could it be that the vital piece of paper that the HOA wants so desperately to bury is right here, among the battered remains of our cabin? Gazing at the rubble, I remember the stories my father told me when I was barely old enough to read. How his grandparents refused to sell the land to developers because they believed in the importance of preserving open spaces. how they'd once donated half of it to the local community, ensuring no one would ever be homeless if they needed a roof over their head. He told me about the orchard that used to bloom here every spring, a cascade of pink flowers that brought entire townsfolk out for family picnics. Now, all I see are giant machines. The orchard is replaced by neatly lined cookie-cutter houses, ironically mandated by the very HOA that just leveled our last piece of living history. And I can't help but feel a sense of betrayal that a place built on such generosity could be destroyed under the guise of progress and uniformity. But I have no time to wallow. I notice one of the demolition workers prying open that old chest I'd found. My heart leaps into my throat. I lock onto him, my camera rolling, stepping over the rubble to demand that he hand it over. He spins around, shock flickering across his face. He clutches a folded piece of parchment. My breath catches. Is that the deed? The next few seconds blur as an HOA official, gray suit, stiff posture, a face like he's never cracked a smile in his life, snatches the paper from the worker's hands. I lunge forward, shouting that this is private property, that he can't just run off with it. He tries to spin a legal justification about everything on the site now being under official review, but I see right through it. He's trembling. The flicker of panic in his eyes is unmistakable. And that's all the confirmation I need. Something in that deed is powerful, something that can bring their entire operation down. It's the perfect cliffhanger, right? You must be wondering what's inside that deed. Does it truly override the HOA's authority? Could my family's old agreement with the city or state or county blow this thing wide open? Let me tell you, I had no idea how far this would go, and the only way to find out was to chase the truth, no matter how much danger or heartbreak stood in my way. It's the kind of risk you take when you're fighting for both justice and your family's legacy. So, with my phone still in hand, capturing the evidence, I vow that I will not back down, no matter what lengths this powerful organization goes to in order to silence me. I remember standing there, feeling the dust settle on my skin, and the enormity of what had just happened crashed over me like a tidal wave. This cabin was more than four walls. It was where my grandmother taught me to bake pies, where cousins gathered for summer reunions, and where my father insisted we keep every letter our ancestors wrote. Seeing it in ruins filled me with a chill that blended anger, grief, and resolve. My eyes skimmed the debris for any trace of heirlooms, maybe a photograph or a rusted trinket that had miraculously survived. Neighbors gathered in stunned silence. One elderly man, Mr. Covington, wiped his eyes and whispered how he'd once chopped firewood here with my grandfather. The mangled remains of the front porch spoke of countless evenings spent watching sunsets, telling stories, and feeling safe in a world that suddenly felt unstable. I felt my fists clench, wishing I could turn back time, knowing all too well that I couldn't. Among the shattered beams and twisted nails, I spotted a stray crowbar. What was once a simple tool now symbolized the brute force the HOA had used, without warning or remorse. That sight transformed my shock into fierce determination. I recalled family stories of how our ancestors opened this land to weary travelers, offering them shelter in a small shed by the orchard. This place was a haven for anyone who needed it, never meant to be subjected to the iron hand of an association obsessed with rigid, one-size-fits-all rules. In that moment, I decided it wasn't enough to mourn. If the HOA truly believed it could invoke some flimsy regulation to justify destroying a historic site, I was determined to prove them wrong. My throat constricted with sorrow, but within it brewed a desperate kind of energy. A journalist nearby snapped photos, and I silently prayed his lens would capture more than my grief. I wanted the world to see the fire in my eyes. In a single day, I'd discovered how quickly what you love can be ripped away if you're not vigilant. Yet, in those splintered remains, I found the spark of a battle I hadn't chosen but couldn't ignore. Clutching my phone, I resolved to fight on every front, moral, legal, and public, because what happened here was bigger than my family cabin. It was about preserving the places that anchor our memories, reminding us of who we are and what we cherish, even when the world tries to bulldoze everything in its path. As I walked away from the wreckage, I caught sight of a wooden signpost, half buried under rubble. It bore our family name in faded paint. I lifted it, hands trembling, and realized that even though the cabin itself was gone, our legacy lived on in every plank and nail scattered across the lot. With that signpost in tow, I promised myself and my ancestors that I would not rest until I unearthed the truth behind this act of destruction, no matter where that pursuit might lead me. In the hours and days that followed, I found myself grappling with a new reality. My ancestral cabin was gone, and the HOA was now in possession of that secret deed. Yet rather than wallow in hopelessness, I channeled my frustration into a relentless quest for answers. Admittedly, I was stepping into uncharted territory. It's not every day a small-town individual picks a fight with an organization that has money, lawyers, and local officials on speed dial. But I've always believed that if you want to expose the truth, you have to step outside your comfort zone. So I began by consulting a lawyer named Grace Nichols, a no-nonsense attorney who specialized in property disputes. I'd met her a few years back when she helped a friend keep her small farm from being seized by the city for a shopping complex. The city lost then, and I hoped that same unstoppable determination would guide me to victory now. Sitting in Grace's cramped office, I laid out every bit of evidence I had. Old letters referencing the land's original purchase, tax records that never once included HOA fees, eyewitness accounts from longtime neighbors who swore the association lines ended well before the edge of our property. Grace's sharp eyes flicked over each page. She paused at certain details, her eyebrows arching in silent acknowledgement. Then she set the papers aside and leaned forward, telling me matter-of-factly, "This could blow up big. We're talking about decades of overreach. The question is, are you ready for the storm that comes with it?" Her words simultaneously thrilled and terrified me. I could almost feel the walls closing in. But I nodded, no hesitation. Whatever secrets the HOA had, I was going to drag them into the light. Grace immediately drafted a letter demanding the deed's return, or at least a chance to inspect it. She also filed a request for a temporary injunction to halt any further development on our property. As expected, the HOA shot back with a wave of countersuits, claiming that the demolition was entirely legal and that I was interfering with community improvement. The local news caught wind of the drama, and before I knew it, a reporter was outside my battered property, microphone in hand, asking about the rumored hidden deed that might topple the mighty HOA. In the end, the construction crew came to Mirage and filled the waste tag in. At first, I was hesitant to speak publicly. I didn't want to show my entire hand or risk tipping off the other side to my next moves, but something in me recognized this as a golden opportunity. If the public realized how murky the household's claims were, maybe the court of public opinion would put pressure on the organization to come clean. So I took a deep breath, stood in front of that camera, and spelled out the basics. That the HOA had demolished my family's long-standing cabin without proper notice, that they had seized a document believed to be crucial in proving the land was never under their jurisdiction, and that I fully intended to fight back. Reactions were mixed. Some neighbors, especially those who'd had their own run-ins with the HOA, cheered me on, offering their time and resources to help. They'd talk about petty fines for minor infractions, paint colors that were a shade off, or grass that grew half an inch too long, and share how powerless they felt. It was like a simmering resentment suddenly found a voice. Others, though, were quick to defend the association, praising the uniform look and property values that came with a tightly regulated community. A small but vocal contingent accused me of seeking attention, claiming I was stirring up drama over a building that, in their words, didn't meet modern standards anyway. I'd brush off their negativity as best I could, even though it stung to see people talk about my family's heritage like it was nothing but an eyesore. While public opinion battled itself, Grace and I uncovered a string of anomalies in the HOA's records. For instance, the official boundary lines they provided were inconsistent with historical maps stored at the county clerk's office. The signature on one critical zoning document looked suspiciously like it had been scanned and pasted from another. We found references to board meetings that supposedly took place a decade ago, approving expansions of the HOA's territory, but no official minutes existed, just a few vague lines about major improvements in the monthly newsletter. The deeper we dug, the more it became clear that a few key individuals on the HOA board might have orchestrated a slow creep of their authority, quietly annexing properties here and there until no one thought to challenge them. One evening, after sifting through pages of old newspaper clippings, I sat at my kitchen table, exhausted but fired up. My phone buzzed, another text from a friend who'd grown up in the area. He'd found a retired city planner who remembered a meeting about the Johnson property line. That was my family name, Johnson. According to this planner, the original deed included a stipulation ensuring the land's permanent exemption from any mandatory membership or oversight by newly formed residential associations. It had something to do with the philanthropic conditions under which my great-great-grandfather donated part of the land to the county. If we could find that specific language, it would be checkmate against the HOA. But we needed the original. For all our searching, we still hadn't laid eyes on the actual deed. The best shot we had was the one the HOA snatched from the demolition site, and that knowledge ate away at me, night after night. We decided to apply pressure another way. Grace found grounds for a discovery motion, compelling the HOA to produce any and all documents related to the property. Meanwhile, I took a more grassroots approach, meeting with neighbors who'd been hit by questionable fines or who suspected that the HOA had tampered with official records. Each conversation turned up new puzzle pieces. Some people had old photos of the cabin standing long before the association's founding, or ephemeral newsletters indicating expansions. It became a groundswell of local activism. Slowly, the narrative was shifting from a homeowner scorn to a community outraged by possible fraud. I started receiving supportive notes from people I'd never met. They'd say things like, "I always thought something was off with the HOA," or "We're behind you, keep fighting." Naturally, not everyone was thrilled. One afternoon, I discovered a letter taped to my front door. No name, no return address, just a single typed paragraph, warning me to cease all public accusations or face serious consequences. My stomach knotted. Threatening letters? That was a line they'd crossed, and it fueled me even more. Part of me was terrified, but another part recognized this as confirmation that we were on the right track. If there wasn't something big to hide, they wouldn't be stooping to scare tactics. Just when we thought we had them cornered, an unexpected blow arrived. The HOA's lawyers petitioned the court to dismiss our case, claiming we lacked standing because, according to them, the cabin was built on association grounds. Ridiculous as it sounded, we had to gear up to refute it. So we compiled every scrap of proof we had about the cabin's pre-HOA existence. We documented every structural upgrade through the decades. We got statements from relatives, from historians who specialized in local property lines. The hearing was a nail-biter. My hands shook as I watched Grace present our case, meticulously walking through each exhibit. The opposing counsel tried to poke holes in our argument, painting the cabin as a run-down shack that the association had to remove for safety reasons. But Grace was relentless. She hammered on the fact that no formal condemnation order existed, nor had they followed standard legal notice procedures. By the time she finished, I saw at least a few eyebrows lifted among the judge and the onlookers. It was a small victory when the judge ruled against dismissal, allowing our suit to proceed. Yet, ironically, that success intensified the HOA's intimidation. I'd see unfamiliar cars idling in my cul-de-sac late at night, headlights off. I'd get phone calls at odd hours, silent on the other end. My neighbors who spoke out in my favor reported similar unnerving instances, suspicious flyers left in their mailboxes, weird looks from men in suits at the local diner. It began to feel like we were part of some conspiracy movie, but even so, we pressed forward. I found that every scare tactic bolstered my resolve. Each new threat was another sign that the HOA had everything to lose if I proved what I suspected, that their entire claim to our land was built on fraudulent paperwork and underhanded annexations, and that the original deed my ancestors left behind would reveal the truth for all to see. The big break came from an unlikely source, a teenage intern at the county clerk's office. One morning, Grace called me, her voice trembling with excitement. "You won't believe what just landed in my inbox." The intern had come across a misfiled binder labeled Johnson Land Grant 1912. Inside it were scanned copies of correspondences that explicitly laid out the conditions for the land donation. The family, in no uncertain terms, retained certain freedoms and protections from forced assimilation into any future homeowners association. My eyes flooded with tears as Grace read the exact text. It was like hearing my ancestors speak across a century, safeguarding the rights they believed so deeply in. And yet, we still needed the physical deed, the final puzzle piece that the HOA had snatched at the demolition site. We could sense how damaging it must be for them. They'd withheld it from us, playing ignorant, but if we could pry it from their clutches, we'd have them dead to rights. We hammered the HOA's legal team with demands, citing the newly discovered documents from the binder. They hemmed and hawed, claiming they needed more time to review, that they weren't sure if the deed in question was valid. Meanwhile, rumors swirled. Key board members were pointing fingers at each other, some abruptly resigned, and a hush fell over the usual community newsletters. You could feel the association's foundation cracking. Our next court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, and everyone in town seemed to be talking about it. I was just as eager as anyone to see how it would unfold, but inside I was terrified. What if the judge sided with them? What if my family's rightful exemption was overshadowed by modern zoning laws? 1,000 what-ifs plagued me, but I tried to stay centered, reminding myself that truth has a way of surfacing, even in the face of well-funded opposition. The day arrived with a crisp, sunny sky, the courthouse steps buzzing with reporters, onlookers, and activists. Stepping inside felt like marching into a final showdown. Grace looked poised in a charcoal-colored blazer, her confidence radiating. Across the aisle, the HOA's team wore somber faces. The board members in attendance looked worried, stealing glances at me but refusing to make eye contact for more than a second. I settled into my seat, nerves on edge. Then, right before the hearing began, a young paralegal from the HOA side approached us timidly. She hesitated, glancing around to be sure no one was watching, then handed Grace a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter from the association's president, acknowledging they'd found the original deed in the debris. "We are prepared," the letter read, "to discuss an out-of-court settlement." My heart soared. They were blinking first. They must have realized the jig was up. Grace, ever cautious, signaled for me to keep my composure. We didn't want to celebrate prematurely. Court convened and the judge asked if there were any updates before proceeding with testimony. The HOA's lead counsel stood, revealing that they wished to withdraw their objection to our discovery request and submit the deed as evidence. He spoke in a flat monotone, but you could detect the undertone of capitulation. They had nowhere left to hide. Now it was official. The one document they'd worked so hard to conceal would finally be on record. There, in black and white, was the exact text my ancestor penned, confirming that our cabin and surrounding land were legally protected from any mandatory oversight by a newly formed HOA. This should have been the final dagger in their argument, but what happened next surprised even me. As the judge flipped through the pages, she paused at certain sections. She then requested the presence of an expert witness on property law to verify authenticity. The expert, who had been consulted earlier, took a quick look and nodded. "These appear consistent with the style and language of the period, Your Honor," he stated. The judge placed the deed aside and glared over her reading glasses at the HOA's counsel. "Why," she demanded, "did it take so long for this document to surface?" The lawyer fumbled through an explanation about oversights and clerical errors, but the judge's face remained stony. Finally, she announced that the court would be reconvening the next week to determine the appropriate remedy, if any, for the demolition of the cabin and the possible fraud underlying the HOA's jurisdiction. But her tone made it clear she was unimpressed with the association's evasiveness. When the gavel struck, an electrifying hush swept the room, and then a flood of murmurs and whispers erupted. I exhaled a breath I'd been holding for what felt like years. My father would have been proud. My grandmother would have been proud. In that moment, for all the fear and loss, I felt vindicated. We'd shown that our land rights had been violated, and we'd forced the HOA to reveal the truth. Grace and I stepped outside, the air feeling somehow lighter, and were quickly surrounded by reporters wanting a statement. I kept it simple. We just want justice and respect for our family's history. If the association had done this to us, how many others had they imposed upon with equally questionable authority? I couldn't wait for the final hearing to find out. I soon learned my struggle went beyond property lines or bylaws. Each day I juggled frantic calls with lawyers and inquiries from local media, realizing I had become, however unwillingly, a spokesperson for those who felt voiceless against the HOA's reach. One afternoon, while sifting through old photos, I found an image of the cabin during a summer festival decades ago. Children running barefoot, neighbors chatting around potluck table. That snapshot reminded me how the cabin once united everyone, free of judgment. The difference between then and now bolstered my resolve. As I mapped out my legal strategy, a wave of local support emerged. People confided their own run-ins with the HOA. Arbitrary fines, vague warnings, and an overwhelming sense that no one dared question the system. A single mother had been cited for excessively colorful curtains. Another family was fined for letting their kids draw chalk art on the sidewalk. These stories fueled my determination. Meanwhile, hints of backlash multiplied. A neighbor who once sympathized went silent, and anonymous letters landed in my mailbox, urging me to drop the lawsuit for my own good. Each threat shook me, but I refused to yield. In preparation for court, I pored over land records with my attorney and a local archivist. Together, we uncovered references to historic grants contradicting the HOA's official stance. Something insidious lurked within the association's ranks, a quiet corruption that needed exposing. Throughout it all, memories of the cabin in its glory days never left my mind. That vision of neighbors cooperating, children laughing, and families bonding reminded me that this fight was about preserving more than a single building. It was about defending an ethos of community, compassion, and respect, values that stood in stark contrast to an organization dictating how people should live, one code violation at a time. Every document I uncovered added to my conviction that victory here meant safeguarding a sense of belonging for everyone, not just those who played by arbitrary rules. On evenings when the pressure felt unbearable, I'd revisit those joyful snapshots of past festivals, reminding myself that if the HOA's brazen act went unchecked, future generations might never experience that kind of unbridled community spirit. Old friends who recalled the cabin's warm gatherings sent me messages of support, lending me strength when anxiety threatened to overwhelm. Each voice of encouragement served as a rallying cry. We deserved to live in a neighborhood guided by kindness, not fear or intimidation. That conviction kept me forging ahead, determined to shine a light on every hidden record and corner of injustice. I also discovered a trove of letters from families who'd moved away after clashing with the HOA, each describing a similar pattern of harassment. Their collective testimony underscored that my fight wasn't an isolated case, but part of a larger struggle against a broken system. The days leading up to that final court date were equal parts anxious and exhilarating. With the original deed now in our possession, Grace prepared a comprehensive brief detailing the fraudulent extension of the HOA's boundaries. If you're wondering whether the deed also contained references that might affect other local residents, the answer is yes. It included a clause describing how any expansions of a future association had to gain unanimous approval from all existing landowners. That clause was never followed. Legally, it suggested that the very formation of the HOA's controlling territory might be built on a lie. This revelation sent shockwaves through the community, igniting fierce debates at town hall meetings, coffee shops, and local dinner tables. For years, many residents had simply assumed that paying HOA dues and living under strict regulations was the inevitable cost of living here. Now they discovered that might not be the case at all. If the association could stoop to demolishing a historic cabin to hide a document that threatened its legitimacy, what else had it hidden? On the night before we were set to appear in court, I received a phone call from someone who introduced themselves as a concerned HOA board member. They wouldn't give their name, clearly afraid of retaliation. They claimed to have inside information about emails and memos indicating that top officials were fully aware our cabin stood outside their jurisdiction. Yet they approved the demolition anyway to prevent us from discovering the truth. My blood boiled at the audacity, but a flicker of triumph coursed through me too. The final pieces were falling into place. I told this anonymous caller to share whatever they had with my attorney, reassuring them that whistleblower protections might apply. They hesitated, saying they feared for their job and reputation, but I could sense their conscience was winning out. That conversation ended with them promising to think it over. I prayed they'd do the right thing. By morning, a handful of scanned documents arrived in Grace's inbox from an encrypted email address. These documents were explosive. Board meeting notes explicitly discussing the risk of the Johnson deed invalidating a large chunk of the HOA's claims. One line read, "If discovered, we may be forced to return thousands in dues to local homeowners." Another line suggested swift action be taken. It was chilling, like reading a script for corporate sabotage. Armed with this new evidence, we marched into court feeling unstoppable. Even so, I couldn't shake the jitters. The process of standing up for what's right can be terrifying. But the memory of my demolished cabin, once the heart and soul of my family's legacy, gave me the courage to see this through. The final hearing was a spectacle. Cameras flashed in the hallway. Local news anchors spoke urgently about the potential downfall of our once powerful HOA. Inside, you could taste the tension in the air. The association's lawyers looked haggard, flipping through binders of documents as though praying for a miracle. The judge took her seat and everything quieted. Grace presented the newly uncovered evidence with the calm precision of a seasoned litigator. She showed the court the board meeting notes, the historical deed, and the binder from the county clerk's office. It was the trifecta of proof. The original family deed that carved out our land from the HOA's reach, the internal emails admitting they knew they lacked authority, and official records indicating how they'd systematically expanded. The judge reviewed each piece carefully, occasionally glancing at the opposing counsel, who offered feeble objections that were promptly overruled. After nearly an hour of evidence presentation, the courtroom felt poised on a razor's edge, every ear straining to hear the verdict. Then, in a soft but firm voice, the judge made her ruling. She declared that the demolition of the cabin was unlawful, as the HOA had no valid jurisdiction over our property. She chastised the association for withholding the deed and for the deliberate attempt to hide information from the court. She invited me and Grace to file further civil claims for damages, which we fully intended to do. In an unprecedented twist, the judge also ordered a thorough audit of the HOA's records, to be overseen by an independent auditor, to determine if other properties had been similarly misclassified. The entire chamber erupted in murmured excitement. This was no mere victory for me, it was a seismic shift that threatened to dismantle the very foundation of how the HOA operated in our town. My cheeks felt hot, my eyes misted with tears. We had done it. Justice was served. And even though nothing could bring back the physical structure of our beloved cabin, at least our family's honor and the land's integrity had been vindicated. Reporters flooded around us as we walked out. A swirl of questions came at me from every angle. How do you feel about the ruling? Will you rebuild the cabin? What does this mean for HOAs across the state? I tried to stay gracious, though my heart pounded with overwhelming emotion. I'm just glad the truth is out, I said. We all deserve transparency and respect for our history. I hope this sets a precedent for anyone who's ever felt bullied by an organization claiming more power than it has. Not exactly the most poetic statement, but it was honest. Deep down, I hope that families all over the country might see our story and realize that sometimes standing up to big entities is not only possible, it's necessary. In the days that followed, community discussions erupted. Some people demanded the dissolution of the HOA entirely. Others wanted a restructuring and more oversight. The mayor stepped in, calling for calm and promising that local authorities would watch the audit closely. As for me, I visited the site of the demolished cabin one last time. The land was so quiet, nothing but the rustling of the trees we'd planted decades ago and the chirping of birds overhead. In my hand, I held a copy of the deed, now dog-eared from the months of legal battles. I knelt and let my fingers graze the dirt, where the cabin's foundation once stood. A swirl of memories flooded back. Family gatherings, holiday meals, the stories my grandmother told by the crackling fireplace. Though the building was gone, the spirit remained. I whispered a silent promise to rebuild someday. Maybe not exactly as it was, but in a way that honors the past while giving our community a space to gather, to celebrate, and to remember how easily something precious can be taken if we're not vigilant. A week later, I was reading through messages of support when my phone chimed. Another text from the unknown number that had sent Grace the board meeting notes. All it said was, "I did the right thing. Thank you for giving me the courage." It reminded me how even in the darkest corners of corruption there can be people quietly yearning to do what's right. They just need a spark to act on their conscience. Perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Knowing that one person's stand against injustice can inspire others to stand too. In a way, it renewed my faith in humanity's capacity for good, even when faced with fear and intimidation. Now that the dust has settled, I'm reflecting on the entire ordeal. What's the lesson here, you might ask? The story may sound like it's about property rights and demolitions, but at its core, it's about the power of perseverance and moral conviction. Sometimes we feel small against big institutions, but as this journey proved, the truth doesn't bow to intimidation. If you keep shining a light on it, it will stand firm. The world can be unfair, and people in power sometimes use that power for selfish ends. Yet when we band together, armed with legal knowledge, community support, and the courage to speak up, no mountain of bureaucracy or intimidation can fully douse the sparks of justice. So to everyone watching, I urge you to never give up on what's rightfully yours. Be it a piece of land or the freedom to live without fear. Stand tall, stand firm, and know that your voice can make an impact far greater than you ever imagined. And that, my friends, is what I want to leave you with. Cherish your roots, question authority when it overreaches, and never underestimate the difference a determined individual or community can make. Sometimes you'll feel lonely in the fight. Sometimes you'll want to throw in the towel. But keep pushing, keep digging for the truth, and you just might find that hidden deed that changes everything. If there's one philosophical lesson that resonates more than any other from this experience, it's this: when we guard our integrity and hold on to hope, even the most powerful forces can be held to account. That's a truth as enduring as the land my family and I strove so fiercely to defend. The closer we inched toward the final hearing, the more I sensed a seismic shift in the community. Neighbors who once kept their heads down began attending council meetings, demanding explanations and questioning long-standing HOA policies. A few board members resigned under mounting scrutiny, and the local newspaper ran a series of investigative articles exposing financial irregularities linked to the association. It seemed that our small town was waking up from a long slumber, finally ready to confront those who had wielded power unchecked. During that tense period, I often found myself reflecting on the deeper meaning of ownership and stewardship. Did possessing land merely entail following the codes someone else drafted? Or did it also involve upholding the history and spirit of the place? With every court filing and every piece of evidence submitted, I felt the weight of my ancestors' legacy on my shoulders. They had built this cabin as more than a roof and walls. It was an invitation for neighbors to gather, share food, and forge lifelong bonds. On the eve of the hearing, a hush fell over our usually lively neighborhood. People hung signs in their windows saying, "Save our history," while others left handwritten notes of support in my mailbox. Even those who once criticized my fight seemed to realize the HOA's demolition had broader implications. If an organization could trample on one family's heritage, what might it do next? That collective question hung in the air, uniting residents from all walks of life. The day of the hearing dawned bright and cool, the sun piercing through morning fog in a symbolic gesture of clarity. I dressed carefully, reminding myself that I was walking into more than a legal proceeding. I was stepping onto a stage where the fate of our neighborhood values would be decided. My attorney gave me a reassuring pat on the back as we entered the courthouse, a majestic brick building that once served as a local government hub when the town was a fraction of its current size. Inside the packed courtroom, faces from every corner of the community watched intently. The judge's stern gaze seemed to probe the very foundation of the HOA's claims, challenging the association's counsel to justify their action. My heart hammered in my chest as we presented the newly discovered documents, photographs, and testimonies, each piece weaving a tapestry of a land and a family long predating any current rules. And when the final ruling fell in our favor, a collective exhale rippled through the room, followed by smiles, nods, and hushed words of relief. Even in victory, I recognized our work wasn't finished. The cabin lay in ruins, and the HOA's structure would require thorough audits and reforms. Yet the win showed that ordinary people could stand against overreach, that a community's shared heritage held power beyond mere legal definitions. In the days that followed, neighbors joined me in planning a commemorative event on the land where the cabin once stood, a chance to celebrate not just the ruling, but the very essence of unity. And as I watched children chase each other across the open field where walls once rose, I felt certain we had rekindled something precious, the idea that land and legacy belong to everyone who cherishes them. Looking back, I realized I'd fought not just to restore my family's history, but to protect a communal spirit that had flickered under the HOA's rigid grip. If a single cabin, humble though it was, could galvanize such a movement, perhaps there was hope for countless other towns locked in similar struggles. The final lesson was one of perseverance. Sometimes you must brave the discomfort of taking on powerful entities to shield the narratives and traditions that shape your identity. In doing so, you honor the voices of the past, safeguard the possibilities of the future, and remind every individual that they have a place in the tapestry of the community. After all, a home isn't just a structure, it's a story, and stories deserve to be told, not trampled over by those who fail to see their worth.